Well, now that we took care of all the problems of the world,
There's one left, elections.
while we were gone, we lowered all of your taxes and left Iraq, all in one. We thank you for your patience, and we will begin our questioning now. Mr. Vargas, this nation has an unfortunate history of discrimination against minority voters. Long after enactment of the Voting Rights Act, forms of discrimination still exist. A survey of Latino elected officials and civic leaders by your organization found that over half of the respondents have either experienced voting discrimination or have witnessed it. What are now the most prevalent forms of discrimination against minority voters? Are sufficient election resources being directed, in your opinion, with jurisdictions that have these problems or that have low-income communities? Is it a matter of not enough voting machines, well-trained poll workers? What should state and local election officials do to prevent discrimination? And I know that a lot of folks, I think in this country at times don't understand this. You know, I look at everything when I look at the Latino community based on my experience as someone who was born in Puerto Rico, and I find that that's different from folks that are born in other countries outside the U.S. And its territories, because they, in so many cases, come from situations where voting was something that they had to fight the military to get or fight somebody else to get. And they come here and they know they have all the rights in the world, but it doesn't take much to keep them from I remember in New York one year we had a situation with asbestos in the schools, and someone suggested, I can't believe they suggested this, that we should have elections that year outside the school buildings, because we use schools in New York City, as you know, in the schoolyard, in a tent, and have the National Guard guarding the machines. I said, no, don't you see they come from systems where the military stands around so that they don't vote? The last thing you want is the National Guard hanging around an election poll. So what forms this discrimination when it takes place takes these days?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that record and for that question. And if you like, I actually brought a copy of that study that we conducted on discrimination. I could submit it along with my testimony for the
That would be
record.
great. That would be great.
Certainly, the implementation of voter ID and citizenship requirements has been uneven, and in some cases, poll workers without adequate training have been requiring certain.
You meant proof of citizenship
Proof of
requirements.
citizenship.
I want to make clear no one takes us up on that.
Right. And individuals like yourself, sir, you know, whether you were born in Puerto Rico or on the mainland, you're a U.S. citizen by birth, and we don't walk around with passports necessarily. And so what we have seen, though, from calls to our hotline have been reports of people being asked to prove their citizenship when the kind of requirement that's not being required in certain jurisdictions. What we see as the most pervasive issue is the lack of appropriate training of poll workers who are not familiar with exactly what the requirements are of the law, and they see themselves as the last line of defense between democracy and voter fraud, when in fact it's just people who are trying to exercise their right to vote. Many times folks are not aware that if their names do not appear in the voter rolls, they have a right to a provisional ballot, and poll workers do not advise them of that right. So many voters are in fact disenfranchised because they are sent away if they don't find their names on the voting rolls. So what we believe is most needed is adequate training of poll workers, that poll workers be fully advised of what the rights are of language minorities, that if a U.S. citizen comes into the polling place and they are not yet fully proficient in English, they do have the right to vote, even though they may not yet speak English. And that is especially true for senior citizens who are naturalized U.S. citizens who do not need to show knowledge of English to become a U.S. citizen if they're over 65 years of age. In all these instances, many times, people who are voting for the first time may be discouraged if they're not being given full assistance in the voting process.
It's interesting what you're telling us, because when people hear the word discrimination, they usually think of an aggressive desire to do some harm to you. And you're saying that mostly this is not necessarily people not wanting these folks to vote, but not being prepared to really deal with them and know, for instance, that you don't have to ask for this or you don't have to ask for that. And you're right, they see themselves as the last way. So training of poll workers, but that continues to be a problem, right? I mean, I find even in our area where people used to line up to work at the polls, now you have to go and find them. Is it, in your opinion, just a matter of interest, lack of interest on the part of the citizenry? Is it that we don't pay them enough? Why are we not getting enough poll workers?
Well, certainly there is, a great disincentive to give up a full workday to work for only a nominal amount and do a civic duty as to working as a poll worker. But one of the programs that we implemented a few years ago, which I think is something that bears replication, is that we partnered at the Nalel Educational Fund with the Secretary of State of California, who was at the time Bill Jones, and State Farm Insurance Companies, where State Farm Insurance Companies gave their agents the day off with pay to work as poll workers. And it was an incentive especially for those State Farm employees who could speak languages other than English, so that they could go work. So they did not lose a day of pay. In fact, the company paid them still their daily salary, and they were able to, we had over, I think it was a couple hundred State Farm employees be able to work the polls. So I think there are some creative, innovative ways when we can have public, private, nonprofit partnerships to try to fill the need that we have for poll workers.
Well, that's interesting. Of course, you didn't tell us that half of the voters switched to State Farm, right? Right after the election. The Brennan Center has always done a lot of work in this area, and I commend the work that you all do, but I'm very familiar with the work of the Brennan Center. How significant is the issue of voter fraud, in your opinion? What are some examples of voter fraud? But interestingly enough, what are some examples of things that some people perceive to be voter fraud and in fact are not?
Well, thank you. We've actually recently completed an extensive study on this topic called The Truth About Voter Fraud, which I have brought copies of, and we'd be happy also to submit that.
Without objection.
The question depends on your definition of the term voter fraud. Election misconduct is something that that exists, and there are problems. Vote buying exists. There have been ballot tampering. There have been documented instances. But what we've been hearing a lot of noise about over the past couple of years has been a thing called in-person voter fraud or impersonation fraud, where referring to when an individual voter shows up at a polling place and pretends to be the somebody else on the voter rolls in order to vote in their place. And that is something that has been used to justify a range of restrictions on voting, and most commonly voter ID. And that is something that we have found almost never occurs. We have done an extensive study of all of the documented allegations of voter fraud and found of that sort, and found this is something that is extraordinarily rare, and it in fact doesn't make sense. The benefit to the putative fraud fees is very minimal. It's one marginal vote. The risk of getting caught is high, and the penalties are extraordinary, 5 years in prison and $10,000 in penalties. So, according to our studies, this is, and which are consistent with virtually all other studies that are out there, including the study that was discussed this morning from that the EAC had commissioned, found that this is something that is really not a problem in our elections today.
Right. And that's an interesting point, because it would seem to me that if you are malicious enough to try to commit voter fraud, that one is so easy to get caught at, and then the penalty is so severe. So why the complaint by some folks that there's, vast voter fraud going on in the country? I mean, I think there was a problem in 2000 with counting votes. I've seen examples of voter intimidation. I remember a few years ago in New York City, we had an election for mayor, and what happened was that on election morning, pasted flyers showed up saying that immigration would be checking citizenship at the polls. Well, those of us, especially in the Hispanic community, know that even if you're a citizen, there's still a chilling effect from immigration. You know, the IRS and immigration seem to upset all Americans. And so the idea that immigration would be asking, which was not true, we feel, and some people claim, kept citizens away. It didn't keep away the folks that were trying to break that law that day. You know, and the other point here is that there are people who swear that undocumented aliens want to vote. If you know the behavior of undocumented aliens, the whole idea is to stay in the shadows of society. It's not to come and say, here I am, I'm going to go on election day and be seen by the police and everybody, and you can catch me. That's not the point. In fact, it's just the opposite. They become citizens, they register to vote, and then you have to convince them to vote. So is voter intimidation an issue that's stronger than voter fraud as we know it?
Oh, yeah, I mean, we would certainly say so. We agree that the phantom of in-person voter fraud has been used to try and justify a range of restrictions on voting, some of which you mentioned, proof of citizenship requirements, ID bills, but also unfair purges of the voter roll, certain other uses of databases to restrict access to voting, and that's a real problem. And when there are real other, threats to the integrity of our elections, voter intimidation, as Mr. Vargas had testified, is a significant problem that's been documented, especially by election protection hotlines, significantly over the past 2 election cycles. And there's also the threat of the security of our elections from the insecure voting systems that we have, and the fact that we don't actually audit any of the audit records that our voting systems have in place.
Thank you. Mr. Matthews, what do you look for? What are the complaints when there are complaints about the issue of voter fraud or voter intimidation or suppressing the vote, if you get any of those complaints? What form do they take?
Well, we did have one case prior to the Ohio voter ID law enactment where a father impersonated his son at the Board of Elections to vote. So it does occur, and in the environment when we're talking about one vote really counts, it may have been one situation, but it did occur. And I think you're in a position where you don't know the extent of it. I don't get many complaints about that. I don't get many complaints about intimidation.
What do you get complaints about?
Accessibility, long lines in the suburbs. Those are the kind of complaints that I receive. There's not a, I think there's some anecdotal information when 400 or 500 people show up and vote a provisional ballot on a presidential election. They're not even registered to vote. That may be election misconduct. There may be some walking around money out there. You can't prove that. And I mean, those are some things that some people raise as possibilities.
Right.
But we don't see much.
Well, let me ask you a question on that. I find traditionally in New York that people will register to vote. I mean, it happens much less now. But they will honestly register to vote wherever the voter registration drive. And then that was not processed. So they go on election day feeling that they were registered, and yet they're not. Well, they're not lying about it. They honestly think that they're registered. So how up to date in Ohio do you feel are your voters' rolls? As an example of one state. I mean, it's unfair. You're the only person representing the state here, but maybe we can get some feeling of what's going on out there.
Well, I think that we're very up to date with our voter rolls. Not only new registrations, but existing registrations. One of the laws that we have is a election notification that for our March primary, we mailed a notification to every registered voter informing them of their poll location.
Right.
So this serves 2 purposes, and it actually pleases both sides. We're informing people where to vote. We're also cleaning up our rolls if that notice is bounced back. And then we do a follow-up mailing that is forwardable to tell them to change their address. And that's done in plenty of time before the close of registration. So they're not forced to vote a provisional ballot.
Mr. Regular.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Matthews, you mentioned Ohio's voter identification law. What are the characteristics of that? What is required?
Well, some form of either a photo ID is ideal that contains an address. If it's a driver's license, it's not required to be a current address. However, there's a number of other government documents and including utility bills that are that suffice for the identification requirement in Ohio.
Has it worked pretty well to prevent, for lack of a better term, fraud?
I think it's worked well. I think that through education, most voters realize that it is required. I'm not sure if it prevents fraud. I know that if you're required to show some form of ID, then there is a verification process there.
What's your experience in getting poll workers? I hear this complaint from many sources.
Well, as has been mentioned, you need proper training of poll workers. And every year we seem, either at the state or federal level, to add additional responsibilities and burdens to the poll workers through, also not only through state and federal, but through the court system. We add additional burdens to the poll workers. And so what we're seeing is a huge turnover in poll workers. They're getting to the point where they don't want the responsibility. You have certain activists that are accusing them of being part of the problem. And so we have a tremendous turnover now. Retention it's not only recruitment, it's retention. So you're constantly in a training mode. So for example, they may not, it doesn't happen in Stark County, of course, but it does, as Mr. Vargas said, you know, there are instances where they're not aware that in a federal election they're required to offer a provisional ballot if someone is not in the book. So the problem with the poll workers is multifaceted. It's not just limited to the responsibilities. It's limited to the length of day. It's limited. It's includes the pay. And oddly, we have some people that are doing it for the money, and those aren't necessarily the ones you want to be recruiting.
Do you have any experience where companies or firms of any kind will give their employees a day's pay if they serve as a poll worker?
Yes, matter of fact, we championed a state law that allowed public employees to do that. And I did that when I was president of the Ohio Association of Election Officials. I made that one of my goals for the year that I was president. And we were able to pass it. Of course, the County Commissioners Association and the Municipal League and a few others watered it down a little. Like we were going to bankrupt them, I guess. And we have reached out to various corporations. We also are extensively utilizing high school and college students. In some counties in Ohio, I've been told that 10% of their poll workers are high school students.
Is there any minimum age required for poll worker?
Ideally, you want an 18-year-old, but the Ohio law does allow a 17-year-old.
17 is the cutoff then.
As long as they're going to be 18 by the November election, yes.
Another problem, I think, is we're a very mobile population. People are constantly moving on their job. And so on. Do you find that difficult to get people are moving in to establish their residence so they are eligible at the next election?
Yes, I was very excited about the pilot project that the Pew Charitable Trusts are in charge of with regard to Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky, I believe, where when they file a change of address with the Postal Service, which not everyone does, you know, they will be, when they receive their packet, they will receive voter registration forms. One thing that I've done locally with realtors is that when they're closing, a home, they will hand over a couple voter registration cards also. Again, that doesn't touch everyone, and it really doesn't touch the most mobile of our population. And, you know, I think in presidential years, you have various groups that are out registering people, and it's amazing over the summer leading up to a November general election, some people move 3 times. And because we received 3 registrations at 3 different addresses, and it isn't a case of fraud. It is a fact that they've moved, because once someone registers in Ohio, we're required to mail them a notice. And if 2 bounce back and 1 is deliverable, then we know that's not a case of fraud where someone is registering in multiple locations.
You heard Mr. Bonner talk about their problems with military personnel, and of course our county doesn't have the volume that they would in some locations. Do you have any problem getting the military people getting them an opportunity to vote?
Yes, we have the same frustrations, I think, that everyone has documented, that sometimes even if we have an up-to-date address, by the time we mail the ballot and it's delivered, they've moved on. And, for example, this year in a presidential primary election in Ohio, absentee balloting starts 25 days before the election.
Does it close at a given time?
It closes effectively the day before the election for absentee. For mail-out purposes, it's the Saturday before the election. But in a normal election, it's 35 days, but for some reason in a presidential primary, it's 25 days, which makes it very difficult. That is our first mailing, always, is the military and overseas ballots. They go out the first legal day, and everything that we have to that point. And the frustrating problem is that it's not getting forwarded, and then it's not being returned in time to be counted. They are given additional days, after the election, but still, if they're not being delivered in the first place, it doesn't help. Something really needs to be done with that.
Tell us about the Pew program that Mr. Matthews alluded to.
It is a program, as was mentioned, where we include voter registration forms in the change of address. It gets included in that packet, which has a 100% open rate. So even though everyone doesn't request one and get it mailed, when it does get out, it gets opened. And we are going to test whether that does indeed increase the chances that people who move will then update their voter registration forms.
Well, the objective would be to get more people the opportunity to vote, even though they're moving around. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. And I might also point out we have another project also in Ohio where we are testing some online poll worker training to try to address some of the issues around poll worker training. And I think that some of the other experiments that ultimately are worth looking at is whether the precinct-based approach, which does require a very large temporary workforce in terms of poll worker training, might be supplemented or in some cases replaced by vote centers, where you would have the opportunity to have a smaller and possibly more professional poll worker staff, because you would need fewer people.
I'm interested. I think someone earlier said you could register online to vote. Is that correct?
In some states you can. It is up to the states, indeed.
What's Ohio's position?
Ohio does not allow that currently. They want an actual signature on the document under existing Ohio law.
It would seem to me that would open itself up a little bit to fraud, where it's an online, you're not sure who's inputting at the other end. How do you verify it?
In terms of the voter registration?
Yes.
Well, I think it may be less a problem in terms of technology for voter registration and getting a blank ballot, which I think the big challenge is particularly for overseas voters, than actually the returning of the filled-out ballot, which is a significant challenge yet to be met.
You would verify it the same way you verify a regular registration. You would send a mailing to the address. And if it was a first-time registration through mail, you would well, and now Ohio requires ID anyway, so I guess that's, and you would verify the signature that way, the name.
Has the funds thus far that have been made available to the the group that are funded under this Help America Vote been adequate in your judgment? Any of you want to comment on that? Because there be some some effort to give them more money. You think they're adequately funded to do their job? Yes.
We certainly support greater funding under HAVA to the states to implement the massive changes that HAVA had required in voting technology, both in terms of voting systems and the statewide voter registration databases. There's a lot that is not as effective as it could be.
Well, it would seem like people would make a decision on the state or as to what system they're going to use and then do it, and not take the money to change the whole system over to something else.
Well, there are jurisdictions that are not changing their system as well. I'm not taking a position on the changing of systems, but even with the existing systems, there's additional funds that are needed to make sure that they function properly, to make sure that states can actually appropriately audit them and maintain the systems, to make sure that the databases have proper functionality. So there's a range of needs that states have in order to make, that don't involve changing their systems as well.
If I could add, sir, we believe one of the areas where additional funding would be helpful would be to educate the public about the mechanics of voting, how to register to vote, and then especially when there are new technologies being introduced at the polling location, how to actually use the polling machines. Many times people are intimidated when they go vote and all of a sudden it's a different system than the one that they have been used to. So there is a need for ongoing public education.
Thank you, Mr.
Chairman, may I comment on that? I can't speak to the funding for the EHC itself, but I would think that 3.6 billion funding on new equipment was a pretty substantial number. I think that before any funding for new voting equipment, I think that we ought to wait until standards are established so that when we spend the money the next time, you are spending it on equipment that meets the latest standards. One area where you could have additional funding is for the electronic poll book. And that is, instead of someone coming to the polls and checking in manually with a paper-based system, you could have it electronic. You could have your entire county database on that electronic poll book, so if they showed up at the wrong location, you could direct them to the correct location. Sometimes lines are formed not because of too few machines, but the check-in process, because we're dealing with an older crowd that is our poll worker group right now, and they're just not as quick. And that's can be helped through equipment like electronic poll books. So I wouldn't mind seeing funding for that, but I think until we develop standards on new voting equipment, we could change every 2 years.
And Mr. Matthews, as an interested Democrat, I'm tempted to ask you if everything's in place for next Tuesday. You guys are up next Tuesday, right?
Yes. Tuesday is going to be very interesting on many levels in Ohio.
Yes, I would say, and in Texas too. I'm intrigued by the thought of voting near work rather than having to go back. We lose so many voters, I think, because they have to leave early in the morning. There's a problem checking in, but they're coming back after 9 o'clock at night. And even though New York has long hours from 6 in the morning to 9 p.m., there's still some people who get caught up in that. And then I'm very intrigued by the thought of, in the same way that we have a Social Security card, to have a voter card that allows you to vote wherever you are at that point, where you're living in that jurisdiction, without having to register everywhere you go. From one building to another, you have to re-register. But I'm reminded by the smart folks back here that states have those rights and they take very seriously their desire to run their own system. So how realistic is it that we can reach a time here when we have some kind of universal, you know, voting ability, if you will, in this country? And yes,
I think it's entirely realistic to assume that ultimately you could reach the point of having a portable registration system. I think part of the challenge is that the field has been appropriately from the election officials' standpoint
press your button.
very focused on the next election.
Right.
And it's a difficult field. It's a resource poor field, and it's a difficult field within which to take a long-term look. It is part of the luxury that we have is really taking a look beyond the 2008 election, looking out to 2012, and trying to find ways for states to begin to test some of these innovations and really understand what works, what doesn't, and how it works, and how to help the states begin to implement these things.
Well, we have a database for a Social Security card. I can't believe, I'm speaking to Mr. Vargas now. Can you believe I'm talking about national cards here, you know? That's another issue. We have, wherever we go in this country with our Social Security number, it works. How much thought has gone into the possibility of establishing a system where you could go with a voter registration card anywhere in the country? And then you kind of have to sign up with that community, right? You just can't walk in and say, I'm voting in his district today when I was in the Bronx last week. How does that work? You could only vote in the area where you're residing. Would that be the plan?
The Brennan Center is actually currently studying this exact question as to how to move towards a system of more universal voter registration where the government takes a more affirmative responsibility for making sure that all citizens are registered and can vote. And there are a range of different options that we are considering. We don't have a final set of recommendations, but some things that make us hopeful that this is really available in the near future, might be available in the near future. For one thing, the massive technological advances that were brought by the statewide voter registration databases, the experience in many states with election day registration, the work that Pew Charitable Trust is funding to experiment with portable registration. I think that we're a lot closer to that day when voter registration doesn't serve as much of a barrier than we were just a few years ago. And we'd be happy to share our work with the committee as soon as it's
Please,
complete.
we would like to see that.
Mr.
Vargas.
Serrano, I would be, I think we should be very cautious about trying to replicate a voting system based on the Social Security system. While you may think it works, it doesn't work for everybody necessarily. Right. And I know of many of your colleagues who continuously get constituent complaints about their names not being accurate on the Social Security administration rolls, and because of some snafu, some bureaucratic snafu. We would not want somebody's right to vote be denied because of some bureaucratic snafu.
Right, but we have that problem now. Obviously, any system we put forth, we would have to look at what we have in place now and see how it can be adjusted. And certainly, Social Security cards are not perfect. In fact, there are other people on Lou Dobbs every night who tell you how they're not perfect in another way. But my point is, this whole thing, for instance, I've never understood the notion in New York, and I'm sure it happens in a lot of states, that if you don't vote in 4 elections in a row, I believe that's what the law still is, you lose your registration. Well, no, if voting is that important, a right as a citizen, then I should have it from the day I turn 18 to the day I die, and I should not lose it because I chose not to vote for 4 years while I was out of the country or so on. Yet I know the records have to be kept of people. So my question is, how do we deal with those two issues in that case, for instance, and how do we deal with the possibility of having the ability to register once and then you vote the rest of your life anywhere you go in the country? Is that possible? Yes, sir.
I'm not sure that that's possible, but I may touch on a couple points you raised earlier about voting anywhere, voting near work. Keep in mind that if you're going to have a vote center concept like that, you need to be looking at technology capabilities versus paper-based systems. Because as long as we're a precinct-based system, you know, we're voting on those issues and those candidates that are localized to where we reside. And to have a vote center that has every single ballot style
Right.
available for that jurisdiction, for that county, let's say, is impossible. That's usually called a board of elections, but but as far as a vote center concept, this is primarily a case where you can really use the technology of the DRE, because you can have every ballot style. And so I would embrace a vote center concept if it included that component.
Right.
Otherwise, I'm not sure how that would work.
Well, let me tell you that a little bit of it, Mr. Regular, is part of my mischievous way. The whole idea of creating havoc on all the pundits who tell you who voted where. Can you imagine if all the people from the South Bronx voted at work in the middle of Manhattan, and then it would look like Mr. Nadler's district voted the way the South Bronx used to vote all the time? I mean, those guys will go crazy on TV that night, and that would be nice.
I think it'd be difficult for the very reasons that
Right.
Mr. Matthews points out, because you got to have a locale. An anchor is where you live. And if you got a vote center next to your factory, it seems to me that it would be hard to keep track of things.
You could do that if you were online and you had the technology to make it happen, but a paper-based system does not work, in my opinion.
It would just wreck polling. I love that. And the big CNN maps where they say, how's the other, no, they don't know how they voted. And that's good. Well, listen, this is an ongoing issue. If there is something dramatic about this, or sad, is that the greatest democracy on earth maybe committed the sin that New York City committed with its subway system. It was running well, it worked well, and no one thought it needed any repairs. And all of a sudden, a few years ago, they realized that it needed a lot of help. I think for so long, our voting system, our democracy has worked well, and people just took it for granted and didn't pay attention to it. And now we find that there are many issues and many problems that threaten, in my opinion, the very democracy that we all love and are sworn to protect. And so I can see no greater issue in terms of protecting our rights and securing our future right now than making sure that we get accurate counts, that we open the system up to everybody who is eligible to vote, and to encourage people to vote. This year may be the beginning of that. If the numbers hold in terms of the young people that have been voting, then there will be a demand on the system like we've never seen before in November, but it'll be a healthy demand. Young people saying, yes, I'm not cynical. I want to be part of this society. This is my country, and I want to protect it by casting my vote. So we all are challenged to make sure that this takes place. And I certainly thank all of you for your input and for your worthy information that we will use as we go along. And we thank you for your involvement today. And this hearing is now adjourned.